Welcome to my podcast on bagpipe composers and the music of the bagpipe. My name is Dr. Jordan Alexander Key. I'm a composer and a bagpiper, and I started this podcast and its related series of musical recordings to share with you music for this instrument that I love. This is episode 3, Roderick Campbell, the grandfather of Canadian bagpiping. Though not a household name to the average piper, Roderick Campbell's contribution to the catalogue of great pipe tunes is outstanding. For those who today treasure his tunes, his best and perhaps most beloved are the stately 2/4 marches, the Royal Scottish Piper Society, and the Edinburgh City Police Pipe Band. The bold 6/8 marches, the Laird of Auchernach and the Banks of the Skiach, the classic Strathspeys, Tulloch Castle and Loch Loskin, and the stunning reels Malcolm Johnston, Alexander Wood, and Cecily Ross. Let's take a moment before we continue to set the stage and get a taste of this composer by listening to 4 of Roderick's little jigs, which are largely unknown. Each one on its own is a little gem. However, when concatenated into a set of 4, they are a remarkable tour de force of jig composition, spanning 8 satisfyingly exhilarating parts, modulating from E hypophrygian in Miss Campbell of Skinness, to A minor hexatonic in his nameless jig, to B Aeolian in Willie Nicholson, to a quick detour to G Lydian before a final return to E hypophrygian in the Ferryside Lasses. What we know of Roderick is scarce. The facts of his life that we have can be summed up in a short paragraph. Roderick Campbell, also known as Rody to his friends, was born on May 24, 1873 in Loch Broom, Rothshire, to Thomas Campbell and Margaret Morrison, both 27, who had married in 1855. Sandy Cameron reportedly heard him play before Roderick had received any formal instruction. Being amazed by Roderick's ability, Cameron subsequently became his teacher. Roderick won the gold medal at Oban in 1908 and the Open Pibroch there in 1910. He was piper to both the Count de Serra-Largo at Tarlogie House, near Tain, Rothshire, and to Colonel Scott at Draycott House in Derby, England. After World War I, he settled in Edinburgh, where he spent most of his time making reeds and teaching, while also working for the North British Rubber Company at Fountainbridge. Roderick died a single man on August 4, 1937, of pulmonary tuberculosis in Southfield Sanatorium in Edinburgh. It was noted in his death certificate that he was a, quote, professional piper. Aside from these details, very little is known about him. He was extremely prolific, and his tunes are dotted throughout many older collections of bagpipe music, including Logan's collection, Ross's collection, and the books of John Wilson, Edinburgh, who was his most famous pupil. John Wilson spoke highly of him as a teacher and friend. In his autobiography, A Professional Piper in Peace and War, Wilson wrote, Rody died in August 1937. Dr. Simpson told me that there was nothing organically wrong with Rody, but that he had lost the desire to live and just turned his face to the wall and died. He was buried in Liberton Cemetery, and I attended the funeral on my way to some games. Some people thought it strange that I didn't play a lament at the graveside, but I was never asked, and I was never one to thrust myself forward. His death was a great loss to me, for we had a very happy relationship. He was not only my teacher for 20 years, but also my good friend, for we had so much in common. As is so often the case, once he was gone, I bitterly blamed myself for not doing more to help him. I redeemed his 2 medals from the pawn shop, and one of them was the Argyllshire Gathering gold medal. It was thicker and heavier than mine, and when I met Roddy's brother Alex at Oban in September, I told him that if he didn't want to pay what it cost me to redeem the medals, I would be very happy to keep them, but no such luck. Highland bagpipe historian Jeannie Campbell kindly investigated just who this great contributor to the bagpipe world was. Her overview is the most comprehensive look at Roderick Campbell. I will give you the most salient details from this historical dive. Beyond his contributions to the repertoire of bagpipe music, Roderick Campbell has contributed to the history of bagpiping in a global way. As pointed out by Jeannie Campbell, Roderick was the teacher of some of the most influential Canadian bagpipers of the 20th century, one of whom is John Wilson, mentioned previously. What John Wilson had received from his teacher, Jeannie Campbell writes, he passed on to his pupils. Therefore, in many ways, Roderick is the grandfather of the Canadian bagpiping tradition, a tradition which is very strong to this day. To honor the legacy of his teacher, John Wilson offers us his own eponymous jig composition. This jig is in the classical style with uneven held and cut rhythms. What I find particularly interesting about Wilson's jig is that it progressively gets lower, on average, over the course of the work. The general expectation in bagpipe music in 4 sections is that the first part will occupy the middle of the bagpipe's range. The second part will be mostly the higher half of the range, the third part will focus on the lower half of the range, and the fourth part will employ the entire range with more emphasis on the upper half. Wilson's piece begins high and slowly becomes lower, the first part being the highest, the second part medium-high, the third part medium, and the fourth part being the lowest on average. To honor both John Wilson and Roderick Campbell, I have included in this edition of Roderick's music a modernized arrangement of this jig. The modern version takes the presently popular, even style of equally valued rhythms and adds to this some unconventional embellishments and florid runs borrowed from the border piping tradition. I made this colorful decision in part because it reflects my own style, but also partly due to Roderick's own penchant for unconventional writing for the bagpipe. As we will see in this survey of Roderick's music, he often makes thoughtfully pleasant, though difficult to execute decisions in his compositions. Let's listen to both versions of Wilson's jig. Roderick grew up the son of a shepherd. In 1871, 2 years before Roderick's birth, his father and mother were living at Tanamore Shepherd's House, Loch Broom. Though by the time Roderick was about 8 in 1881, the family lived in Auchernach farm cottage, Loch Broom. Roderick had 3 older brothers, Murdo, Alexander, and John, and 2 older sisters, Janet and Mary. By 1891, when Roderick was about 18, his father Thomas died. Roderick's mother, now widowed, moved to Ballyvoolish, Uri, Ross, and Cromarty with her 2 daughters, all of whom were employed as farm or domestic servants. According to Jeannie Campbell, the 3 older boys, Murdo, John, and Alexander, cannot be found with certainty in 1891, as the names are quite common. Unfortunately, the problem of commonplace names also applies to Roderick Campbell, as several people have the same age and name in various occupations and locations. There are numerous mentions of Roderick Campbell pipers during this time, as Jeannie notes and gives details of. However, it is impossible to know which Roderick is which, since it seems that there were quite a few Roderick Campbell pipers during the early period from 1873 to 1900. Even in one game at Strathpey in August 1900, there were 2 pipers named Roderick Campbell, R. Campbell of Strathpey and R. Campbell of Tain, both of whom placed first and second in the MSR competition. The Roderick Campbell of Strathpey appears in numerous records during the last decade of the 19th century and first decade of the 20th century. He played for numerous events and won numerous competitions between 1897 and 1903. This, however, is not our Roderick Campbell of Loch Broom. By 1901, our Roderick appears in the census records as employed at Tarlogie House, Tain, Ross, and Cromarty, as piper to the Count de Serra Largo. The household at Tarlogie House in 1901 was a large one. In addition to the Count, there was the South African-born Countess, the 5 sons, Purcell, Cecil, Lionel, who were born in South America, and Raoul and Edwin, who were born in Scotland, and the 2 daughters, Elizabeth and Mimosa, who were born in Scotland. This substantial passel of children all ranged from the age of 2 to 13. To this formidable bunch we add bachelor Roderick Campbell at age 27 as the domestic piper for the estate, and finally, 7 female servants complete the household. After Peter Alexander Cameron Mackenzie became the Count de Serra Largo and moved to Tain, he lived in Tarlogie House, and both he and his wife took an active part in the life of the community. As Jeannie aptly points out, the title, Piper to the Count de Serra Largo, might seem strange, both for the piper and for the Highland Laird. Let's take a quick detour to learn a bit about the Count de Serra Largo before we listen to his march. Count Peter Alexander Cameron Mackenzie, born in Kingussie in 1856, was the son of postmaster James Mackenzie and Elizabeth McCrae. By the age of 14, Peter worked as a student teacher in Kingussie, but then opted for a commercial career with Messrs. Stewart and MacDonald, Glasgow. He then took up employment with the Singer Manufacturing Company. After holding various posts in Europe, Mackenzie became the company's South American representative with his headquarters in Rio de Janeiro, where he had extensive commercial and banking interests. In 1886, he married Dona Anicia Augusta de Amaral, the daughter of a Portuguese minister of state. He returned to Kingussie in 1892, but continued to make regular trips to Brazil. In 1896, for reasons presently unknown, the King of Portugal gave him the title Count de Serra Largo, to recognize unspecified services to the Portuguese people living in Brazil. In 1899, he bought a huge estate at Tarlogie near Tain, but still made frequent visits to Kingussie, where he showed generosity to many clubs and social activities. Mackenzie was chieftain to the Shinty Club for 34 years, the same club for which Roderick Campbell wrote his competition march, the Kingussie Shinty Club's March. The Count was deeply involved in local events, and a keen supporter of Highland sports and pastimes. He died in 1931 due to a war-related illness, aged 75. Roderick Campbell's 2-4 competition march, the Count de Serra Largo's March, honors his eponymous employer at Tarlogie House. In this march, we will hear an early example of what I consider 2 of Roderick's stylistic markers, angularity and subtle peculiarity. While perhaps only a piper well seasoned in the genre of Scottish competition 2-4 marches might fully appreciate the nuances of Roderick's style, these stylistic markers will return again and again throughout our study here, so I find them worth mentioning. While certainly not unique to Roderick, angularity and subtle peculiarity characterize much of his output. As you listen to this piece, notice the second line of the tune's first part. While it is far from experimental, it is certainly infused with a seeming unpredictability in its profusion of short, long, accented rhythms and whimsical upward tritone leaps and downward minor sixth leaps. This tune, as we will see with others, also seems to defy melodic expectations and conventions. I find that when I play Roderick's tunes, I am often surprised here and there. My mind anticipates a classical melodic gesture, idiomatic embellishment patterning, and typical harmonic motion, and then I am taken aback with delight to find something subtly novel gently peppered into his work. Consider line 2, measure 3. While not unique, I find this accented high A quite unusual. Not only is it emphasized by being on the first beat, it is also the highest pitch of the line and is on the first beat of an odd measure, which accents it within the musical phrase. However, the shortness of the note defies this arrival point. It is difficult to play this note not due to technique, but due to psychology. Everything in my musical being wants to reinforce this arrival, but Roderick denies this expectation. Another peculiarity in this piece is the tackum gestures from D to B in part 3, which also appear in part 4. While these are not unusual generally, they are surprisingly difficult to accurately execute with speed and clarity, since they come from E. Furthermore, the 2 times this gesture appears, it is rhythmically the same on the micro level, but on the macro level of the musical phrase, it is in quite a different position, and thus needs a totally different performative accenting. Furthermore, this whole gesture is complicated by the fact that it happens on the fastest rhythmic values in the piece, on the trickiest part of the bagpipe's range, moving from E to D. The motion from E to D on the bagpipe is quite fraught for most beginner bagpipers, and requires much practice to be done cleanly. Generally, once mastered, this transitional pivot point in the scale is easy enough. However, Roderick has given us just enough of a complication that we are prompted to reassess our ability to execute this pivot. Given that we are coming from E with the embellishment of a G grace note to D, followed by an E grace note to B, and given that this is all done in a fraction of a second, Roderick is asking the utmost of a skilled piper's agility. This is such a fine detail in the larger picture, but it is this fine detail that is so charming in Roderick's music. Not only is this gesture a wonderful etude in the difficulty of the E to D pivot, but it is also a marvelous rhythmic twisting of the gesture to have it appear twice in the same part in totally different accentuated contexts. Let's listen now to this rarely heard gem, Roderick Campbell's 2/4 competition march, the Count de Serra-Largo's March. During this period from the last decade of the 19th century to the first few years of the 20th, Great Britain was immersed in its most expensive war since the Napoleonic Wars of 1803 to 1815, the Second Boer War, also known as the South African War, from 1899 to 1902, fought between Great Britain and the two Dutch Boer or Afrikaner republics, the South African Republic and the Orange Free State, resulting in British victory. A fuller discussion of this war and the pipers involved can be found in the upcoming episode on bagpiper John McClellan. During the last year of this war in 1901, Roderick's brother John Campbell died while serving with the Lovat Scouts at Orange River. A report in the North Star newspaper on October 3, 1901, gave further information on Roderick Campbell's brother, John. The Lovat Scouts Casualties. Identity of John Campbell. It now transpires that the member of the Lovat Scouts reported as killed in the engagement in which the regiment was concerned at the Orange River on September 20th is not John Campbell, belonging to Inverness. He was a native of Loch Broom, and his father was for 20 years in the service of the late Colonel Davidson of Tulloch as a shepherd. Prior to his enlistment, he acted as stillman in the Ord distillery. He was 29 years of age, and both his parents are dead. He was well known about Dingwall. His brother is Mr. Roderick Campbell, piper to the Count de Serra-Largo at Tarlogie. On reading the list of casualties, Mr. Roderick Campbell wired to the War Office. He received the following reply. Regret, 36670, Private John Campbell, killed September 20, near Quaggersfontein, Orange River Colony. He knew that 36670 was his brother's number, as he had been in constant correspondence with him. Deceased, being of a quiet and obliging disposition, was respected, not only by his employer and fellow workmen, but by all with whom he came in contact, and his death is much regretted in the Moor of Ord district, where he was well known. The death of his brother inspired Roderick to compose his only pibroch, Lament for John Campbell. This lament is distinctly remarkable in the bagpiping repertoire for being written in the haunting and exceedingly rare bagpipe modality of F-sharp hypophrygian. I think the choice of this mode is quite intentional. It lends a distinct melancholy to the piece that the more typical mode of A mixolydian tends to lack. The half-cadential conclusion on C-sharp, the dominant of F-sharp Phrygian, I think also demonstrates the sadness of this loss for Roderick, and perhaps Roderick's unresolved feelings in having his brother die a world away, without being able to give his last goodbyes. Unfortunately, this experience would have not been unique in the course of war. Let's listen to the Urlar, or first part, of the Lament for John Campbell. By 1905, Roderick had moved to Glasgow. Why he went there and how he made his living during these years is not yet known. During 1905, Roderick Campbell was one piper involved in the controversy over the Skiach Society's gold medal competition at the Argyllshire gathering. The judges for this competition included the famous Archibald Campbell of Kilberry, along with Lord Dunmore, Major Stewart of Insay, Captain Colin McRae, and Mr. J. MacKillop, Jr. There were 7 competitors for the medal that day, which was unusually frigid and wet. Due to the inclement weather, 2 competitors, John McDougall Gillies and John McColl, both broke down while playing the Lament for John Garve MacLeod of Rassay. John MacDonald played the Lament for Patrick Ogg McCrimmon, and the other 4 pipers played the Prince's Salute. James Centre, William Ross, and Roderick Campbell played it by the book, but George Allen played the first variation differently. This was a lineup of what would become some of the most renowned pipers of the early 20th century. Eventually, after much discussion and argument, the result was announced as first, John MacDonald, second, James Centre, third, G.S. Allen, fourth, William Ross, and fifth, Roderick Campbell. The prizes were to be presented on the second day. However, early on the following day, an official handed the £3 prize money to G.S. Allen, who had only won third place. Later, when the result was announced, the prizes were awarded to first, John MacDonald, second, James Centre, third, William Ross, fourth, Roderick Campbell. Following the competition, Judge Stewart of Insay called a committee meeting and disqualified G.S. Allen, overruling the judges appointed by the Society. This competition controversy led to many resignations from the Skiach Society, including the 3 Kilberry brothers, their father John Campbell of Kilberry, James MacKillop, and most of the other knowledgeable members of the Society. It was to be several years before the rift in the Society was healed. Between 1905 and 1910, Roderick Campbell appears in the results of numerous competitions. In July 1905, at Forfar Games, Roderick Campbell was not mentioned in the prize lists for pibrochs or marches, but in strathspeys and reels he took second place. At the Northern meeting in 1905, in the competition for the Highland Society of London's gold medal, Roderick Campbell took second place to Pipe Major George Stewart McLennan. In August 1906, at Denny Highland Games, Roderick Campbell took first in the march and second in the strathspey and reel. At the Northern meeting in 1906, Roderick Campbell took third in the gold medal competition for his rendering of Clan Ronald's Salute. In 1908, at the Argyllshire gathering, Roderick Campbell featured again. He was placed first in the gold medal, first in the march, and third in the strathspey and reel. At the Northern meeting in 1909, in the results of the march competition, Roderick Campbell took second. In 1910, Roderick took first in the open pibroch at the Argyllshire gathering, beating both William Ross and William Laurie of Ballachulish, whom we have discussed previously. During the end of the first decade of the 20th century, Roderick became piper to Colonel Scott of Draycott House, Derbyshire. At the time of the 1911 census, the main household at Draycott House was Hugh Scott, single male, age 45, lieutenant colonel in the army, with 4 female servants. This household had 17 rooms. Roderick Campbell was listed at Draycott House as a separate household of 1 room. He was aged 35, single, born at Lochbroom, and employed as a piper valet. According to Jeanie Campbell, Scott had been Lieutenant Colonel of the Royal Scots Fusiliers and was a member of the Scottish Pipers Society in Edinburgh, so this would be reason enough for him to add a piper to his household. Local records indicate that Roderick was in Derby by January 26, 1909, playing at the annual dinner of the Derby Burns Club on that date. Roderick is mentioned in the history of the Royal Scottish Piper Society concerning the judges employed for their competition, who were sometimes paid for by members of the society. These historical documents of the society state that, quote, in 1909, Lieutenant Colonel Scott from Derby offered the services of Roderick Campbell, his piper, to judge at the competition, end quote. Although Roderick composed the march, the Royal Scottish Piper Society, there is no mention in their history of Roderick being the tutor to the society, which is a popular myth. We will return later to re-examine Roderick's exceptional 2/4 march, the Royal Scottish Piper Society, and the group of gentlemen for which it is named. In 1912, we get the first mention of Roderick Campbell as a composer, though it is likely that he was composing bagpipe music long before this date. In April 1912, newspapers reported the results of the Cowal Highland Gathering competitions for the best original reel in Strathspey. Dr. Bannatyne, Salisbury, Holytown, secured the prize for the reel. But in the Strathspey competition, Roderick Campbell, piper to the Colonel Hugh Scott, Draycott House, Derby, was first. We do not know what Strathspey Roderick entered into this competition, or even if we still have this Strathspey in our repertoire. However, let's examine one of his strathspeys and talk a bit about strathspey composition. While Roderick's most famous strathspeys are perhaps Loch Loskin and Tulloch Castle, I would like to turn our attention to two of his more minor strathspeys, to which I have added two parts: the spinning wheel and Dell. In older sources from the 19th and 18th centuries, most strathspeys come in two parts. Usually one would create longer sections of strathspey music, or accompany longer strathspey dances by concatenating multiple strathspeys, the thoughtful sequencing of which is an art in and of itself. Later, with the rise of competitive bagpiping and the popularity of performing dance music as an art separate from dancing itself, it became more common to find more developed strathspeys in four parts. The generations of pipers straddling the 19th and 20th centuries sit at this aesthetic transition. Often during this period, we find master pipers adding parts to popular older two-parted strathspeys, or composing developed competition strathspeys in four parts. However, these bagpipe composers, as well as those alive today, will still occasionally write two-parted strathspeys for performance by less experienced pipers and pipe bands, or for use with other shorter strathspeys in sequence. Roderick Campbell has both four- and two-parted strathspeys in his oeuvre. For my editions of his music, however, I have attempted to extend all of his two-parted strathspeys to four parts for use by advanced pipers who enjoy the two-parted classics. In this, I am following the tradition of expanding shorter tunes that I particularly enjoy. The compositional activity, or perhaps conversation, of expanding a pipe tune is interesting. The expansion should add to the original but reflect it meaningfully. Thus, this activity puts the two composers in conversation over time and space. While I want to add to what one composer has done, at the same time I want my additions to speak to my style as a piper and composer. In essence, my additions should aim to synthesize my style with the style of the original into a cohesive whole. Often this is done by considering the materials of the given parts and expanding them in a direction that brings them closer to my own voice, though still clearly connected back to the original. Thus, with many additions by composers over many generations, a long tune can become an interesting journey through the evolution of style, aesthetics, and technique. To this end, let's consider the spinning wheel and Dell, which are two of Roderick's more distinctive two-parted strathspeys, which I think sincerely deserve further elaboration. In the spinning wheel, I have used the third part to elaborate on Roderick's original tune by mostly changing the melodic contour from the first part, inverting it by the octave. Where before the melody goes down after each doubling, now it goes up to the same note an octave higher. My personal style as a bagpipe composer relies on heavy embellishment and stark angularity. Thus, on alternating measures in the third part, I have supplied notes with heavy embellishment, as seen in measures 2 of part 3. The modality of the spinning wheel is somewhat odd. In Roderick's first two parts, the tune is solidly in A minor pentatonic, that is, A, B, D, E, and G, with a heavy emphasis on B and G. In my added part 3, we have the introduction of F sharp at the end of measure 3, which should sound somewhat foreign to our ears. This withheld note, once introduced, transforms our modality to A Dorian, since we are still missing the C sharp of the standard bagpipe scale. The fourth part departs starkly from the original tune, though it is still tied to the original through the incorporation of gestures from previous parts. The most different aspect of the fourth part is the runs, which were not at all in the original two parts, though which are idiomatic to strathspeys generally, and often appear in profusion in more advanced pieces. This final part brings the strathspey closer to my own style by providing a high degree of angularity and embellishment. Also noteworthy in part 4 is the subtle appearance of a melodic C sharp, which fully migrates our tune into A mixolydian, and which completes the aggregate of the bagpipe scale. Let's listen to the spinning wheel. Dell is an idyllic spot along the water of Leith on the west side of Edinburgh, and was the inspiration for Roderick Campbell's eponymous Strathspey. Dell, the place, has connections with the famous Scottish author Robert Louis Stevenson, who once played in this sweet wooded riverside spot as a boy when staying with his maternal grandfather, Lewis Balfour, the parish minister of Clinton. There's a statue to Stevenson with some verse that he wrote along the waters of Leith pathway today. I am not the first to write additional parts to Dell. It is clearly a beloved two-part strathspey. With different editions of this tune, one can see differing tastes among pipers. What my edition adds is certainly a penchant for embellishment. Not only to this edition of Dell have I added 2 florid parts, but I have also heightened the level of embellishment in the first 2 parts of the tune to match the added 3rd and 4th part. In this, my performance of the tune has been notated. Just as a pipe organist potentially has the latitude to register their pieces as they see appropriate to the style and their own taste, so too have I, perhaps influenced by my years of study as a pipe organist, registered Dell with some more colorful sounds that might not be traditionally expected. Any seasoned piper's eyebrows might raise to see and hear a cronlua in the context of a strathspey, but I contest that such embellishments need not be the sole purview of Kilmore. Such obscure and virtuosic embellishments have a rhythm, color, and percussion that have many potential applications in bagpipe music broadly. Here, I am experimenting with such dense embellishments in a style of music that typically lends itself to dense embellishment, the strathspey. What I felt this tune lacked in only 2 parts was an exploration of the lower range of the bagpipe. Thus, as is typical in 4-parted tunes, I have made the 3rd part focus on this range. The profusion of burls on low A and doublings and triplings on low G, borrowed from the first part of the tune, infused this part with a percussive boldness only possible through such dense low-range embellishments, used only sparingly in the first part. The 4th part classically opens the range of the tune, emphasizing both low and high together in stark contrasts. To this part I have added references back to Roderick's original runs in Part 2, these runs forming connective tissue between the high and low limits of the instrument. Let's listen to Dell, and take note of my perhaps heretical use of cronluas at the end of each line and how they blend with the rich embellishments of the whole tune. The exact date when Roderick left Derby is not known, but according to Jeannie, it was after 1912 and before 1917. Roderick Campbell had settled in Edinburgh by 1917, when John Wilson began to go to him for instruction. From these studies grew a relationship that continued for 20 years. According to Wilson's autobiography, Campbell was employed by the North British Rubber Company at Fountainbridge. John described him as an excellent teacher, though one that never lavished him with praise. Roderick was a member of the Highland Piper Society, and he encouraged John to enroll and attend the Society's twice-monthly meetings. In the early 1930s, Roderick Campbell surfaced in just a few reports. One article on May 29, 1931, of the Loa Pipe Band Contest described as the first contest held under the new Pipe Band Association rules, indicates that among the judges of the contest was Roderick Campbell of Edinburgh. In 1932 and 33, Roderick was also an adjudicator for a juvenile band contest for Glasgow's Music in the Parks. In 1932, we get a second example of Roderick's prowess as a composer of bagpipe music. At the World Pipe Band Championships at Cowell in 1932, the bands were required to select their MSRs from a book of tunes published for the occasion. These were all tunes from the Cowell composing competitions and included the Strathspey, Loch Loskin by Roderick Campbell. Now let's listen to Roderick's famous Strathspey, Loch Loskin. Roderick died in 1937. The cause of death was pulmonary tuberculosis, and the informant was his brother Alexander Campbell. His death was announced in the Scotsman. Campbell, at Liberton, Edinburgh, on August 4, 1937, Roderick Campbell, noted Scottish piper and composer of pipe music. Funeral today, Friday. Friends desirous of attending, please meet Cortege at Liberton Cemetery Gate at 3 o'clock. His obituaries were brief, and although slightly different in various papers, gave much the same information. This is the most detailed. Mr. Roderick Campbell, Edinburgh, whose funeral took place yesterday at Liberton Cemetery, was well known as a piper and composer of bagpipe music. Although born in the Highlands, he had lived latterly in Edinburgh, where he had many friends. He was a capable teacher of the art in which he excelled, and several pipers owe much of their skill to the help they received from him. Mr. Campbell began his career with Count de Serra-Largo, and later he was piper to Colonel Scott of Draycott House. He was a member of the Highland Piper Society and won their gold medal for Biography. He was also a successful competitor at Highland gatherings. Until quite recently, Mr. Campbell was composing pipe tunes, and about a year ago he composed The Bank of Skiach, which won him a prize and achieved considerable success. It's hard to believe that such a tune as The Bank of Skiach could be penned by a man who is in a dire state of depression at the end of his life. Let's listen to what was probably the last tune written by Roderick Campbell, the bold 6/8 march in A hexatonic, The Bank of Skiach. At this point, as with previous episodes, I would like to highlight additional works from the composer's oeuvre, which I think should get more attention. The first of which is Roderick's 2/4 competition march, the Royal Scottish Piper Society. Personally, I think this 2/4 march stands as one of the greatest 2/4 marches, though it lacks the popularity of what many would consider the greats. The first thing that catches my ear in this tune is its use of E as a modal center. While this is not unique in pipe music, it is rather unique amongst 2/4 marches, most of which are either in A mixolydian or A minor hexatonic or D hypoionian. Occasionally a 2/4 march will be in B aeolian, but in all the hundreds of marches I have encountered in books spanning 3 centuries, the number of 2/4 marches in E hypophrygian could perhaps be counted on only 1 or at most 2 hands. Of all the 2/4 marches that I know of in strange bagpipe modalities, this one is perhaps the most gratifying to play. This sadly underplayed and oft undervalued 2/4 competition march celebrates an organization that, for more than 125 years, has operated under the radar of much of the wider world's piping community. The Scottish Piper Society was founded in 1881 in Edinburgh by a small group of well-to-do piping enthusiasts who were, for the most part, amateur pipers. That is, pipers who were not regarded as professionals either competitively or by vocation. Prime rules of the society were that, quote, "It shall have for its special objects, first, the encouragement of bagpipe playing amongst gentlemen, and secondly, the general advancement of the study of the great Highland bagpipe and its appropriate music." End quote. The society has always been a private club, new members being introduced by existing members and subjected to scrutiny as to their suitability. There were originally 14 members, 11 of them active pipers. Of these men, 5 were lawyers, 6 were army officers, 1 was a wine merchant, another was a banker, and 1 other without a known occupation. All were thought to be fairly young at the time, and most of them were still around on the Society's 50th anniversary. They took their mission seriously, and over the following decades, the group would grow to as many as 350 members, acquire its own meeting rooms in Edinburgh, and provide prizes for some of the premier solo piping events on the piping calendar. The Society's meetings were held until 1914 at the Royal Patten Gymnasium between Ayr Place and Fettes Row, on the north side of the new town in Edinburgh. This was an absolutely incredible outdoor sports center, built by a wealthy businessman to encourage physical activity amongst the masses. Its attractions included an enormous rowing machine for 147 rowers, and many other monstrosities. In 1935, the Society received a visit from the then Prince of Wales, later to become King Edward VIII, to a practice meeting at 38 York Place, through the influence of Colonel C.M. Usher, of the eponymous G.S. MacLennan tune. The Prince was a competent piper himself, apparently having been taught by Pipe Major William Ross, and he had also composed the slow air Mallorca. At the meeting he played with the Society's members, having requested they play The Green Hills, Nut Brown Maiden, and the Skyboat Song. A member of the Society played the Prince's composition, Mallorca, then the Prince played another slow march before joining the members for a refreshment. 18 months later, in 1937, the Prince of Wales' father, King George VI, granted the title Royal to the Scottish Piper Society, and this is where Roderick Campbell's great composition enters the picture. Roderick's exact ties to the Scottish Piper Society are not clear, though he is listed as playing at their annual ball in 1909. Though the Society hired premier pipers to tutor interested members, Roddy Campbell was never listed as a tutor. The inclusion of the word royal in the title of the tune implies that the tune was written in late 1936 or 37, around the time the royal warrant was issued and before the death of Roderick in 1937. It is possible that the tune was an earlier composition written in tribute to the Scottish Piper Society, and that the word royal was added by Willie Ross when he first published the tune in his 4th book in 1943. But if the tune had been written earlier, why would Campbell's great pupil and friend, John Wilson, not have included it along with the Edinburgh City Police Pipe Band in his first book of music published in 1937? Such mysteries are in keeping with the life of Roderick Campbell, of which very little is known. One might expect the original manuscript of the Royal Scottish Piper Society to be in the possession of its namesake organization, along with its many other similar historical artifacts and photos. But it is not, and has not yet come to light. Besides its unusual modal center, structurally the tune is interesting in that it has 2 second parts, each played just once through to create, in essence, a complete 16-bar first and second time. While it works beautifully, it is hard not to be struck by this odd quirk every single time you play the tune. For my own performance of this tune, I like to realize the march with 5 complete parts, which is also unusual. Each of the second parts is lovely in its own right, and I sincerely think each deserves its own repeat. While perhaps not the original intention of the composer, though we still have no way of knowing what that might have been, I like allowing the listener an opportunity to hear again each part of Roderick's piece. Playing each pair of 8 bars in the second part only once seems to my ears to allow them to pass too quickly from our attention. Thus, I repeat each 8-bar phrase of part 2, as is done in each of the other 8-bar parts prior and subsequent. Either way, 4 parts with a non-repeating second part, or 5 repeated parts, the march is rather unique in its construction and quite exceptional in its mode of E-hypodorian on the bagpipe. Let's now listen to this exceptional competition march. Roderick's 2/4 competition march, Colin Thompson, or should I say 2 competition marches, are lesser-known masterpieces of the genre which deserve some attention, if not only for their masterful composition, but for the mere fact that there are 2 such competition marches under the same name with wholly different tunes. We are unsure exactly how Roderick knew Colin Thompson, but by penning at least 1, if not 2 separate tunes in honor of this piper, composer, and reedmaker, Roderick clearly held this man in high esteem. The first version of this tune, a 4-parted 2/4 march, is perhaps the most known edition, since it can be found in the widely disseminated Scots Guards Collection Volume 3, published in 2012. However, the first publication of this version goes back to Volume 3 of Pipe Major W. Ross's collection, published in 1942. Interestingly, 12 years later, in 1954, a piece of the same name, also by Roderick Campbell, appears in Volume 2 of John Wilson's collection, but there are 6 parts, and no part is similar to the earlier version from Ross's collection. What are we to make of this? What would a musicologist make of this? First, we should note that all these publications are after the death of Roderick in 1937. Thus, we can immediately assume that the composer likely had no part in the publication and perhaps editing of the work in 1942 or 1954. We should also note that William Ross and John Wilson are the 2 primary publishers of Roderick's music during and after his life. Roderick was also close with both of these pipers, though he was probably closer to John Wilson. Thus, we can assume that both publishers are good authorities of Roderick's music. Given these notes, there are a few reasonable hypotheses, though as far as I can tell, there is no present answer to this conundrum. The first hypothesis. Roderick performed this piece throughout his life and changed it many times, providing numerous altered sources for the publisher to finally use. One source found its way to John Wilson, while another, either earlier or later source, found its way to William Ross. Though one predated the other in publication, since both dates are after the composer's death, and since both publishers knew the composer while alive, we cannot know which source is actually older. We might assume that John Wilson's is older, since he seems to have known Roderick longer. However, this hypothesis is unsubstantiated. We might equally assume that John Wilson's is a newer version of the piece for having been close to Roderick until the very end of his life, and consequently having access to the most updated version of this piece. This certainly would explain why John Wilson's version is longer, though this does not explain why the 2 tunes are very different. There is so little in common between the tunes that one certainly does not seem like a direct evolution of the other. Second hypothesis. Since very little is actually similar between the 2 pieces, that is, no parts are shared between the 2, and no parts are similar enough to suggest a direct evolution, Roderick might have actually composed 2 different pieces in honor of Colin Thompson. Each such work found its way to each publisher independently, and were known independently by both publishers, who would have known Roderick for a long enough period to have received 2 such separate pieces at varying times. Consequently, we have 2 tunes, though they share a common name. Third hypothesis. One piece is simply incorrectly titled by one of the publishers. This would be the simplest answer, so if we abide by Occam's razor, then this is likely the answer. Perhaps the title was merely a misprint in one edition, or perhaps the publisher was mistaken as to the title. In this case, we should assume either choice A. If a misprint, then one of the editions intended to publish both pieces and accidentally redacted the music of one and the title of the other, and mushed the remaining title and piece together incorrectly. This could be imaginable under some mismatching of printing press typeset blocks. The block for the title of one got mixed with the music of the other, and then the missing halves forgotten or incorrectly sorted in some way. Choice B. If an incorrect recollection of the title, but intentionally printed as such, then the publisher mistaken should have somehow known of such an honorific tune, but confused the title of it with another march, the music of which they recalled. Thus, they superimposed the wrong title and tune in their memory, and published it in this way. I would like to believe some evolution of work, but since the 2 versions of Colin Thompson are so different, I find it difficult to believe. If they are evolutionarily related, there must be very many missing links of this work to take us so far from one to the other. It would be like looking at a bear and a human and thinking, well, they generally look similar. I mean, more similar than a fish and a human. They must be related. Well, yes, they are, but very distantly with many steps back in between. So while both of these Colin Thompson pieces are 2/4 marches in the same mode of A hexatonic, they are too dissimilar to solidly conclude direct linkage. If they are directly related, where are all the steps between? There should likely be many, or else Roderick, in editing the earlier version of this piece, overhauled it in many very fundamental ways, to such an extent that we might justifiably claim them as different tunes altogether. However, it is easier to assume a simple publishing error in either the publisher's memory or printing. Thus, I will go under the assumption that we have two distinct tunes, which for some unknown reason have the same title. They are not likely two versions of the same tune. This is, in part, the fun of studying this piece. For one work, we have two, quite dissimilar, yet both interesting. One is 4-parted, the other 6-parted. The beauty of these pieces speaks for itself. While Ross's version is more widely played, as far as I know, to the utter exclusion of John Wilson's version in the modern repertoire of bands and pipers, I sincerely like the longer version of Wilson. The pieces are utterly different from one another, so I am not comparing quality of versions, but quality of two distinct pieces. However, do not misunderstand me, I do think both marches are excellent works. I gravitate towards Wilson's edition merely because it develops the materials more, presents a higher degree of contrast between the various parts, uses more nuanced and difficult gestures, which is fun for me to learn and play, and employs thoughtful compositional techniques like pitch aggregate completion, which we have looked at in prior episodes. To demonstrate this last point simply, the first tune uses the same collection of pitches throughout, the A hexatonic scale of A, B, D, E, F sharp, and G, while the second tune uses the A hexatonic scale until the final part of the tune, during which we are presented with the completion of the scale with the subtle addition of C sharp. With C sharp, we get the entire bagpipe scale, and the reservation of that note until the end heightens its appearance, even as brief as it is in the tune. This reservation of pitch until the end gives the conclusion a color which the rest of the piece lacked. It is a lot like an accent pillow in a rather neutral room. That one subtle accent, through its contrast, gives life to the otherwise neutral space. Through this beautiful dissonance, we gain harmony. Let's listen to John Wilson's edition of this tune, for both the reason that I think it is better, and for the reason that it is underperformed and unreported today by pipers and pipe bands. Let's give this masterpiece life again. As we listen, notice the arrival of something bright in the last part. That brightening is the subtle appearance of C sharp. Notice as well the contrast and textures between the parts. Lastly, follow thoughtfully the serpentine melodic tapestry Roderick weaves in the stratosphere of the chanter, often orbiting high G, a note I contest Roderick was very fond of highlighting in his oeuvre. Such passages can be tricky for any piper, both in fingerwork and breath control, since high G tends to be one of the most unstable pitches on the instrument. The work is impish and angelic, surly and sweet, bold and pondersome, lively and stoic, a microcosm of yin and yang, if one can become master of it. Speaking of Roderick's fondness for high G-oriented melodies, the final two works I would like to highlight also emphasize the unstable yet hauntingly beautiful dissonance of G on the bagpipes, both low and high. The 6/8 March, the Laird of Auchernach, and the real Cecily Ross are both striking tunes written in the mode of A minor hexatonic, using the notes A, B, D, E, F sharp, and G. As far as my research can deduce, there are two likely possibilities for the honorific to the Laird of Auchernach. During Roderick's life, there was no actual laird at Auchernach. The estate had been sold from the aristocratic line of the Auchernachs into other industrialist families of the late 19th and early 20th century. Thus I might surmise that either 1. Roderick is honoring some past Laird of Auchernach for a reason we cannot assuredly know, or 2. Roderick is honoring one of the owners of the Auchernach estate during his life and calling the owner of Auchernach a laird as part of a bygone tradition, though this person was not technically a lord. During Roderick's life, there were 3 owners of the Auchernach estate. Mr. Charles W. Mackay Forbes of Dunnottar, who flourished in the late 19th century, the family of whom purchased the estate sometime in the early 19th century. William McCarty, 1846 to 1913, who was a famous diamond magnate who purchased the estate in 1901, and George Falconer Rose, 1876 to 1940, who was an engineer frequently working for the British Empire in India, who purchased the estate in 1924 from McCarty's daughter. The estate was eventually sold in 1943 to Messrs. Riddick, who were timber merchants that, realizing the great expense of restoring the progressively dilapidating estate, proposed that the Aberdeen Council might buy the house as a boarding school. But this was to be too expensive, and the house was demolished in 1945. The true and original Lairds of Auchernach had long left the estate in the hands of the Forbes family in the early 19th century. The earliest such Lairds of Auchernach were James Grant in Auchernach, also known as Macallan, mentioned in a remission by King James VI in 1569, and who died sometime during the years 1606 through 1614, and his eldest son Duncan Grant of Auchernach, who died circa 1638. The first mention of the Forbes family at Auchernach, I find, is a reference to a one Laird Nathaniel Forbes, first of Auchernach, who lived sometime between 1700 and 1760. Though records of the house seem to indicate that the building that exchanged hands between Forbes, McCarty, and Rose was built around 1810. It seems unlikely that Roderick would write a piece in honor of some lords far removed from his time and specific genealogical heritage. Roderick would have never personally known the Lairds of Auchernach, even those perhaps living on the estate in the late 18th century. Thus we might assume that the eponymous Laird of Auchernach is either Charles W. Forbes of Dunnottar, William McCarty, or George Falconer Rose. At this point, it is difficult to know which of these 3 men Roderick might have had a fondness for. The only lead I have is that George Falconer Rose had an honorific pipe tune composed for him by the famous George Stuart MacLennan and entitled G.F. Rose of Auchernach. Apparently the famous piper G.S. MacLennan, 1883 through 1929, was a friend of G.F. Rose. Since G.S. MacLennan and Roderick Campbell were contemporaries and both highly regarded pipers by the time G.F. Rose purchased Auchernach in 1924, perhaps both pipers at disparate times found themselves at the estate for one event, retreat, or similar excursion, and, as thanks to the laird of the estate, who was so fond of good bagpiping, and according to the Glenbuchet Heritage Archive, was also a, quote, very able piper, wrote G.F. Rose a tune. Thus, this would date the composition of the Laird of Auchernach between 1924 and Roderick's death in 1937. Though this hypothesis has very little to substantiate itself, I would wager that the Laird of Auchernach in Roderick's piece is indeed G.F. Rose, and that Roderick had some level of acquaintance, if not friendship, with Rose, perhaps through or independent from G.S. MacLennan due to their shared interest in bagpipes and Roderick's fame as a piper in the region during Rose's tenure at Auchernach. Roderick's tune, the Laird of Auchernach, is a typical 6/8 march, following all the classical compositional expectations of a 4-parted piece. It starts highlighting the thematic motives across the impetus of the pipe, has a second part which focuses on high-range materials, a third part focusing on the low range, and a virtuosic fourth part that adeptly spans the gamut of the chanter. There is nothing particularly remarkable about this tune, except for the simple fact that it is well composed and lovely to play. I wish to highlight it because I would love to hear a wider variety of 6/8 marches played amongst pipers. For example, I hear so many pipers play Donald MacLean of Lewis by Donald MacLeod. This is a great tune, but there are other equally great 6/8 marches with similar gravitas, such as the Laird of Auchernach. If you like Donald MacLean of Lewis, then I wager you will like the Laird of Auchernach. I often get approached at Highland Games when I am playing and get asked, "What was that tune? It's great. I've never heard it before." Such comments are merely a symptom of the fact that most pipers just play what they have always heard and what is widely popular, which is a pair of qualities that ultimately reinforce one another. Consequently, the bagpipe repertoire stagnates, and we just hear again and again and again the same tunes, many of which have no magical powers of grand tradition and no monopoly on being a masterpiece, as any listen to a march like the Laird of Auchernach will demonstrate. Thankfully, the personage given honor in our final tune is not as difficult to discern as the Laird of Auchernach. The real Cecily Ross is most assuredly written in honor of the daughter of the famous bagpiper and composer William Ross, MBE, 1878 through 1966, and Edith Mary MacGregor. Cecily Ross, like her father, was active in Gaelic music, winning numerous Royal National Maud medals for her piano performances of traditional Scottish music. I cannot find when Cecily was born and died, but we might assume that she was born sometime after 1903, the year in which Ross and Edith married. If we assume as late as 1910 for her birth, Roderick would have likely encountered Cecily in her teens or 20s, perhaps through her piano playing and/or an association with William Ross, who would have been well known to any piper of the day. The tune stands against other masterpieces of the reel genre, such as John Morrison of Asanthouse or John McKenshie's Big Reel. If this tune was inspired by the piano playing and personage of Cecily Ross, I certainly would have relished the opportunity to hear her perform. The reel is fierce and daring, with many of the stylistic markers of Campbell: traditionalist form, virtuosic fingerwork, clever manipulation of motives, angular melodic constructions, atypical melodic motions, and a fixation on melodies orbiting high G. While all parts of the reel are lovely, I want to draw our attention to parts 3 and 4 most keenly, since in these parts Roderick demonstrates all these stylistic qualities to a high degree. The third part is quite angular, with numerous moments of surprising melodic progression. Let's conclude our survey of Roderick Campbell's life and music by listening to his reel, Cecily Ross. Unquestionably, Roderick Campbell is one of the great classical bagpipe composers. Though he is often overshadowed by more popular contemporary greats like G.S. MacLennan, William Ross, John McColl, and Peter R. MacLeod Sr. Hopefully with some time and further availability of his music to the wider bagpiping community, more of Roderick's excellent music may re-emerge as part of the standard repertoire. If you have enjoyed this podcast and any of my other episodes and series on or performances of bagpipe music, please consider supporting this effort. You can donate to this podcast on Patreon at https://patreon.com/Jordan Alexander Key spelled Key. There you will find all the podcast episodes, previews, updates, and educational materials I have created. Those who subscribed for $15, the Keel More tier, will also gain access to all my present and future bagpipe music editions and educational materials. As part of this episode, I have created the first complete edition of Roderick Campbell's extant works, which is available on Patreon for those in the Keel More tier. All of Roderick's known pieces are presented in clean and elegant notation in my own musical typesetting. Shorter tunes have been extended for pipers wishing to play longer versions of famous tunes like Clinton Dell, and some tunes presently unavailable in modern bagpipe notation, such as Roderick's Skiach, are now made available. Along with the music in each edition, I also give my biographic sketch of the composer as well as a gallery of available historical images. Please consider donating to this educational and artistic mission. Thank you, and stay tuned for more.